then those automatic negative thoughts would come around about like, it's your fault that these things are sliding. They're going to see through you that you're not competent, that you're not good, and you are going to be punished, laid off, fired. You're going to get a bad review, all those sorts of things.
Today on The Hidden Layer, I'm going to be talking to Dave Langer. Now, in the past, Dave has held analytics leadership roles at companies including Schedulicity, Data Science Dojo, and Microsoft. But he now focuses his time running Dave on Data, where he's creating and delivering analytics training. Sounds like he's got it all figured out, right? Well, here we aren't going to be talking about his career or his achievements. We're going to be diving deeper, discussing his struggles and his insecurities, as he tells us about something which has had a big impact on his career and on his life. Remember, we are here to encourage dialogue on any and all topics around mental health. The more we open up on these and support each other along the way, the better. So it's amazing that Dave has come along to talk to us today. Let's take a look. So, Dave Langer, it is an honor to have you on The Hidden Layer, the very first episode of The Hidden Layer. And you are a well-respected name in the field of data analysis and data science and data everything else, to be honest. You've done a lot of different things, and you're doing some great things at the moment, and I know that because you and I often discuss these things together. But without sounding bad, we're not actually here to talk about that today. What I wanted to talk to you about today was, I guess, what's under the hood, or what's behind the scenes, or essentially, I was thinking about this before. What is a way that we can understand the black box, which is the Dave Langer neural network? Because that's where the name, The Hidden Layer, comes from, right? It's this kind of idea that neural networks are black boxes, but if we talk about them a little bit more and we think about how do they work, we can start to understand them, which is where the name The Hidden Layer came from. But when I sort of proposed this idea to you of the hidden layer and asked if there was something that you wanted to be involved with, you actually came back very quickly with the concept that you wanted to talk about. And I guess to me, when you did that, to me, that tells me that this concept that we're going to talk about is something that is, or maybe has been, a big part of your life, or at least has had a big impact on you. And potentially, and we've not talked about this in detail yet, that's what we're here to do today, but potentially that this is something that others could benefit from hearing about, in terms of maybe just them talking more openly about it, or at least hearing ways that you've maybe found to deal with it, or I guess maybe a better way to think about it is to manage it. And it's this concept of negative thinking. And I'm just going to start right at the top, and I'm going to ask you, so what is negative thinking, or maybe more specifically, what does negative thinking mean to you?
Yeah. So if I can, I want to start with a story. And the reason why I responded to you so quickly, by the way, when you were like, hey, I'm going to be doing this thing to talk about mental health and data, I was like, yeah, let's get on board, because I want people to understand that you see somebody like me and I'm flapping my hands and I'm doing talks and all this kind of stuff. And people are like, wow, he's like got it all together. And the answer is, well, maybe I do and maybe I don't. So maybe let's talk a little bit about what really goes inside the melon, inside the melon here. And you can see that I'm just a human being like everybody else. Much to my chagrin, by the way. I've always wanted to be Lieutenant Data from Star Trek, but what are you going to do? So I live in the United States, and we have something called PBS, the Public Broadcasting System. So it's partially funded by the government, and it's kind of this informational, a little less sensationalized media channel for like television. And one night I was watching TV and I was just flipping through the channels, and I landed on my local PBS station, and they had this guy named Dr. Amen on, and he was talking about change your brain, change your life. And at that particular point in his PBS show, he was talking about these things called automatic negative thoughts, or ANTs. And generally speaking, I'm not, as a data guy, as a former software engineer, I'm not really spiritual, I guess is the word I will use. So this guy's a psychiatrist, right? He's a medical doctor, he's a scientist, and he was talking about how a very common problem that people suffer from is automatic negative thoughts. Your brain is wired to have certain thoughts. And the more that you entertain certain types of thoughts, the more those neural pathways build patterns, and you just start repeating them. And I was fascinated because I realized at that point that I had been living my life filled with tons of automatic negative thoughts. I don't know how many. He said, for example, some people might have thousands a day, and that affects their entire outlook on everything. And I was like, whoa, you're talking about me, dude. So I watched the rest of his TV show. I bought his book in physical form. I bought it in an audio copy, and it really affected me a lot. I realized that for me, I had built a pattern in my brain where automatic negative thoughts just happened all the time. And these would range from things like, I'm not good enough, I'm never going to figure this out, or everyone hates me, that kind of thing, all the way to this idea of like automatic negative thoughts about everyone else. Now, the scary thing is, and I won't mention them by name, but at a certain former employer of mine, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be a little bit paranoid about people around you, maybe not necessarily having your best interests in mind. So I had this kind of feedback loop of, I had all the typical negative thoughts about myself, but also about my environment. And I had been positively reinforced, by the way, by having those, right? Kind of having my defenses up. And I just became fascinated with this idea of like, could I be happier? Could I be more productive? Could I have less stress if I followed Dr. Amon's advice and said, look, let's tackle these automatic negative thoughts head on?
And so you mentioned a couple of like ideas around what those negative thoughts that you were having were. How did they manifest themselves for you? Were they things that you were thinking about? Were they the same things every day, or was it different things day to day? What was the patterns that you were seeing?
Yeah, and I want to emphasize this enough, right? This is stuff I learned from reading Dr. Amon's book, is that automatic negative thoughts are totally natural, by the way. They're part of the human condition. The hypothesis is that we develop these over time, evolutionarily speaking, because they're good defense mechanisms. If we're paranoid about the world, we might live longer and reproduce. So if you have them, you're human. Don't blame yourself for having them. There's nothing wrong with you for having them. That's what I want to say first. Mm-hmm. So my patterns were typically focused on general things that were typical for me at that point in time. For example, I used to weigh a lot more than I do now. At one point in time, I weighed over 300 pounds. Mm-hmm. So obviously there would be a whole bevy of natural automatic negative thoughts that I would have as part of my general condition based on that, right? All the things you would expect. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, if there was something going on professionally that I would be very, I'll use this word, it's probably not technically correct, but a bit obsessive about, then automatic negative thoughts would be generated from that general condition. So like if I was in a particular quandary at work in terms of politics, or if a project was sliding behind schedule, or, you name it, then those automatic negative thoughts would come around about like, it's your fault that these things are sliding. They're going to see through you that you're not competent, that you're not good, and you are going to be punished, laid off, fired. You're going to get a bad review, all those sorts of things. And all that's natural, by the way, to have. The question then becomes is like, how much do you actively allow those patterns to repeat in your daily life? Or do you do things to combat them for your own mental health?
And that's interesting that you say that these are natural things that are part of essentially human evolution, because, that's something we're wired to do for a certain reason. But I guess there's a point where, every negative thought like this, and this is my naive assumption, you tell me, based on what you've read and, what you've experienced, if you know differently, but I guess each negative thought we have puts some level of stress on our body, right? And there's more and more research, and evidence coming out about how bad stress is for our body. And so I guess while these are natural things for us to experience, there is a point where it's too many negative thoughts, and that, even though these are a natural thing to happen, there's too many of them going on, and it's having a very negative effect on our body. And the effects that too much stress can have are very serious. So I guess, what you did, finding out maybe by chance that there is a way, or there are ways to rewire your brain to think differently about these is almost very lucky, and I'm really glad that we're talking about this, because I know I'm guaranteed there are going to be a lot of other people that are dealing with this, but like you, maybe didn't realize they were dealing with it, or didn't realize that this was a thing. It was just something they always had done. So you talked a little bit about feeling like people were going to find out that you didn't know what you were talking about. And that's something that we talk about a lot, isn't it, in data and data science. And, we call it imposter syndrome. And I, on the hidden layer, I'm going to be talking to some other people specifically around imposter syndrome, because it is a very common thing. And it's a hard one to talk about. It's one of these ones where we can give advice about what to do. What do you find has been a good way to deal with what I guess we're calling imposter syndrome?
Yeah, and in imposter syndrome, you could be like in this chicken and egg situation. Does my imposter syndrome create the automatic negative thoughts, or is my imposter syndrome a manifestation of all these automatic negative thoughts I'm having? That could be an interesting talk for another day. But when I think about the imposter syndrome question, it's really around this idea of two things, right? It's around this idea of fear of failure, and it's also and I'm going to use machine learning terminology because why not, right? Not adequately creating a predictive model based on historical patterns in your data, right? Which is like, let's say like I was working at a project at a former employer, and by that point I had almost 2 decades of work experience and many, many successful projects. But I would ignore that, right? I would ignore my mighty random forest predicting more than likely your project's going to be okay, because look at all this historical data that says that that's probably the case. And you would just focus on this idea of like, I would ignore that, and I would focus on the fear of failure. And I mean, a lot of the things that we talk about in this space they sound totally cliche, but there's a reason why you still talk about them even after all these years. It's because fear of failure is real. And also this idea of like, you have to embrace it. You have to try new things. You have to challenge yourself. You have to embrace the fear. You have to like work through it. Be smart about it, of course, but push yourself to do it. And also, if you can, fight these automatic negative thoughts and look back at your historical performance, your patterns in your data. Your predictive model will probably tell you whether or not you're likely to be successful in this. And if it's higher than 50%, hey, make sure you focus on that instead of the fear of failure. So for myself, for example, my current situation, I'm doing something I've never done before. You and I were talking about this just earlier, right? This whole thing that we're doing. And there are days, I will fully admit, I am riddled with imposter syndrome of like, what am I thinking? How can I do this? How can I do this? I need to go find a job at a big tech company, start my 401k back up, and that's just what I need to do, as opposed to like what I'm doing right now. And I have to fight imposter syndrome, of course. And also there's a whole bevy of other negative thoughts that come automatically in this space as well, right? And it's mostly around my fear of failure.
And we were talking about this, we're both course creators. We're both in that space at the moment. We've both left our roles, or have no longer had a role. I believe you were let go for COVID related reasons, or downscaling. And this is a whole new space where it's it used to be when you have a full-time job, you go in every day and you work hard, or maybe some days you don't work hard, but at the end of the day you get the money. And now you are responsible every day for bringing in money for your family. And that in itself is a huge stress. And I know that's been a huge stress for me, especially, I finished working in March of 2020 to embark on this journey of creating Data Science Infinity. And I was initially going to work on that for 2 months. I thought, I sketched out a bit of a plan. I think I can do this in 2 months. It was 7 months later before I actually released it. So that was 7 months of living, in London, paying London rent without an income. And looking back on that now, I just like, why did you do that? But luckily the course has, gone really well. And it's been a good decision, but I'm exactly the same as you. I'm trying to add things to the course at the moment to make it even better. And I'm doing a section on deep learning at the moment. And there are some section of, and this has been the same for every section that I've gone through. I've naively thought before I've embarked on creating the slides and the tutorials, this will be easy because I know this stuff. And every time without fail, I find that I didn't know it as well as I thought I did. And you go, wow, have I been thinking that I know this stuff? And I don't, and maybe everyone else seems to know it and I don't, and I'm the one trying to teach it. But eventually you have to fight against these negative repressing thoughts and push through that to a point where you go off and you learn and you learn and you learn, and you end up being able to create something better than you thought you originally could have. And this is a cliche as well, but teaching is just by far the best way of learning. I've learned so much more in the past year than I have in the rest of my career because I've had to do it. I can't take shortcuts, but there has been a huge layer of stress on me being responsible for bringing in money from a product which I have directly designed and people are judging me on. And that's a huge level of, pressure on, that's a weight on your shoulders. I wanted to touch on something else you said, which was you mentioned a few ways that this had affected you. You said that you used to weigh a lot more and there was, potentially some, negative thoughts around that. I mean, were there other ways that this affected your life, outside of work, these negative thoughts?
Oh, yeah. So in a word, stress. I don't know if you've ever watched the IT Crowd, but there's this episode where they're doing stress, and anybody who's stressed at the end of the day is going to be fired. So the kind of this joke of like they're stressing out about being stressed. To this idea of like stress, after watching that PBS episode, I really got in tune, and I know this is going to sound a little bit new agey, so forgive me. I really got a little bit more in tune with my body, my physical state. And I could tell that when I would have particularly powerful automatic negative thoughts, ones that really tugged at the ideas that I held about myself in terms of who I was in the world and what I was accomplishing, my sense of self, that my blood pressure would rise, my heart rate would rise. I would get, the flight or fight response coming. And I started to realize I was working at a large tech company, and I would go into the office and I would have lots of meetings, which was pretty typical because I was a manager at that point. And I would be like, if I had 5 meetings in a day, 2 or 3 of them would elicit that reaction. And some of the meetings might elicit that reaction more than once in the course of an hour. And I started to think to myself, I'm like, this can't be good for me. This can't be good for my overall health, not only my mental health, but also my physical health. So in that regard, what I started to notice was that I was in an elevated fight or flight state a lot because of the result of these automatic negative thoughts. And as I said earlier, in some cases, you were positively rewarded for it, right? If you were like, I'm girded up for war, I'm entering this meeting because I know it's going to be a battle. And if you're sufficiently like jacked up, maybe you're going to win. So sometimes you would get positively reinforced for that. But overall, I started to get to a point where I was like, man, this can't be good for me. Also, given the fact that I was overweight, extremely overweight, I was like, that's probably a double whammy. That's probably not good for me. So that was like one of the biggest manifestations, was this idea that my body was constantly in an elevated state because of the automatic negative thoughts. There wasn't any real physical danger. It wasn't like a saber-toothed tiger was coming to kill me. It was this manager over in this other part of the company is trying to get into my yard, and that's stressing me out. And all the automatic negative thoughts that came along with it. So that was one big thing that I noticed. And I was like, I've got to work on this just for my own long-term health.
Mm. And I guess you'll talk about this in a little bit more, because I'm keen to hear more about this book that you've read. But what you just mentioned there around the idea of a saber-toothed tiger being there, I saw a documentary a while ago, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was centered around the fact that we actually do have using our mind alone, we have the ability to change the way that our body physiologically deals with a certain situation. And I think the example was, and I'm going to try and remember this, I may misremember it, but it was essentially what you'd said there. Two different people would be in the same situation. So person A is confronted with a saber-toothed tiger and person B is confronted with a saber-toothed tiger. Their physiological reactions, even though that's the exact same situation, the physiological reaction on their body in terms of adrenaline and stress and the fight or flight reaction, they don't have to be the same. And based on your experience, or based on the ability you have to control your emotional state at that time, you can actually control how much stress is put on your body, even though you're in the same situation. And like I say, I may be misremembering exactly the example, but that concept that you can be in a situation, or maybe you can be in the same situation twice, but you do have the power to have some control over how much stress that puts on your body. And I thought that was quite a powerful concept, and how you then learn more about that and find ways to actually do that, which I think you're going to hopefully talk about a little bit more when we talk about the book, because for me, I found that interesting concept. But what I want to know from you is, maybe from the things that you've learned, how do we go about doing that? And let me know if I've missed the point of what you want to talk about here. But do tell me a little bit more about the book that you found, because I want to know a little bit more about how they describe these things, and I guess more importantly, and this is how I want to end up sort of wrapping up this session, is with some thoughts of things that you've found that potentially help you deal with these or manage these things. But it is going to be different for everyone. Everyone's coming from a different place. Everyone has a different story. They have a different family, a different job. But I guarantee that some of the things that you might have learned from that book may resonate with some people. So can you maybe talk to us a little bit about the book, and then also maybe towards what sort of things you can do to help manage negative thoughts?
Yes. And just so you know, I make no affiliate revenue from this whatsoever. So this is the book was called Change Your Brain, Change Your Life by Dr. Amen. I think his first name is Daniel Amen, I believe. And he's written a number of bestsellers in the United States, and they might be translated to other languages worldwide as well. I'm not quite sure about that. And he runs a particular type of clinic where he tries to take a science-based, holistic approach to mental health. So he's a big fan. I think it's PET scans is the thing that he uses. And what he does is he looks at your brain first. And one of the things that I found immensely interesting about reading the book is exactly what you were articulating, Andrew. It was this idea that different people are going to have different experiences in the world because their brains are different. And one of the examples he uses in the book as to exemplify this is head trauma. People who bang their head, right? A car accident or whatever it might be. And what he said in the book, which I found really interesting, and also related to me, by the way, my own personal experience, was that most people don't realize they've had head trauma when they have, and it can affect their brain, and that affects everything else in their life. So for example, what happened to me when I was around 10 or 11 years old, I was riding my bicycle real fast down a hill, and I crashed, and I hit my head on the curb on the side of the road, and I knocked myself out. So I was like, oh, wow, I've had a head injury as well. So that might have, like, in very crass terms, maybe put a flat spot on my brain somewhere. I don't know. And it changes the way I react to the world. So what the book was saying is, like, look, everyone's brain is different. It's the sum totality of your unique experiences. So you're going to perceive and react to the world probably differently than somebody else. And that's only natural. And that's just the way it works. And here are all the different ways that can manifest. So he talks about, real physical things, like if they find a brain tumor, they might need to remove it surgically. And he also talks about using medications to use your brain to alter your brain chemistry, of course, as well as nutrition. But lastly, probably the thing that was most important for me personally was he also talks about the things you can do behaviorally to change your brain and change your life. Because the whole idea basically is that as a human being, your experience is essentially dictated by your brain, first and foremost. So you need to take care of it. You need to nurture it. You need to grow it. You need to maintain it and develop it. And so he talks a lot about these techniques. So one of them, and I believe they're rooted in what's known as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. So this idea of, for example, with automatic negative thoughts, one of the exercises he talks about in the books that anybody can do, you don't need any professional help with this, is a system of you write down the thought, the negative thought, and then essentially what you do is you dissect it logically and say, basically you go through a process and you use pencil and paper because that works really well for your brain as well to actually write things out physically, to write through the process and evaluate the automatic negative thought. And then essentially what it does is it teaches your brain that these thoughts, while they happen, they don't actually have any power. They don't actually have any validity. And eventually what happens is that you have them less and less, and it causes you less stress and it allows you to tackle more things because your automatic negative thoughts aren't holding you back from attempting new things or just enjoying your life in general. So the book is immensely interesting for any number of reasons, but there's also some very practical tools and techniques that it teaches that anybody can use.
Yeah, and interesting that you say that. My and this is a bit of a personal story. My wife recently bought us both journals to write in, and I'd never written in a journal before, but this is it's a specific journal which kind of goes along the same idea. And there are several things that you need to write every day, and one of them, the two which stood out to me was that I never would have thought of doing is at the very start of the day is to write down something that's going to go well that day, something that could happen that would lead to a positive reaction from you. And the other one was to, at the very end of the day, write down a couple of things that you were grateful for that happened that day. And they seem very simple things, but the idea behind it is kind of exactly what you're saying. It's trying to, repeating that behavior every day can have the power to rewire your brain in a more positive way, to the point where you're starting to see more positive things. It's kind of the way he described it, and he wasn't trying to be scientific in this sense, but was the idea that when you learn about a new word, for example, you start seeing that word everywhere. And he wasn't saying this was the exact scientific, way of thinking. It was an analogy for it. But if you start putting positive thoughts into your head, you'll start seeing more positive events during the day. And it's going to be a small change, a subtle change to start with. But, once you get that ball rolling, you are hopefully going to be able to rewire your brain away from negative thinking and more towards positive thinking. And I do really like that concept. So we've just started doing that. And I quite enjoy doing it. At the very least, it forces you to think about something positive, because a lot of the time, and I've got young children, and it's always there's time pressure and there's lack of sleep, and there's always something to complain about because you're tired, or you don't have any energy. But the sort of approach, it forces you to think about something positive, and I think that can only be a good thing. Do you think that the ideas that are in the book, do you think they could work equally well for different people coming from different, or in just different situations? I gather from what you've said that it probably would. Everyone might take a slightly different view on it, but it would be equally, useful for different people.
Well, I wouldn't say it's going to work for everybody, because with 7+ billion people on the planet, are there some people that never have automatic negative thoughts, or very rarely? Statistically speaking, it's probable. But most humans, from what I've read and understand, this is a natural thing for us to do, is to have automatic negative thoughts. The question is, it's a spectrum. Like, are you at a comfortable level of the spectrum so that you can lead a healthy life? And for me personally, the answer was no. And I found the tools and techniques that I read in the book quite useful. And I modified some of the things that are different from the book, because I would go Google and do research around this whole idea of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and that kind of thing. And I'm by no means an expert, by the way. And I would do things for myself. I would modify some of the tools and techniques. And I I think personally, finding that show on PBS one night randomly, and then getting the book and getting the audiobook and listening to it, and really grokking this idea that, one, my brain is pretty much in charge of how everything in my life goes to a certain extent, or probably the full extent. And two, it can learn bad behavioral patterns, and I can actively do things to change those. Those two things were wildly useful, and I think that applies to a broad audience. So you might be able to find some of his videos on YouTube, for Dr. Amon's videos on YouTube, for example, and you can check them out before putting any money down for one of his books. But I think, yeah, they're broadly applicable to anybody, and they do work. But that's the thing. You have to establish a pattern, a habit, to do the thing to counteract the other pattern and habit that you have. And as humans, we're not so great at that. So you have to force yourself to build a new pattern, a new habit.
Yeah. But I think, I think people hearing about this, I guarantee that this is going to resonate with them in some way. And sometimes all it takes is to, read or hear somebody talk about these types of things in a way that you hadn't thought about it. And that can spark something inside of you to recognize that this is something that you're dealing with. And as soon as you do that, it becomes a whole lot easier to understand that maybe, you can apply a change that might have an effect on you. And, you really do, like you say, as humans, we're not that good at it, but you do need to almost buy into this concept to follow through with it, because a lot of these things are a habit. Like you said, it can't just be one day you try it and the next day you're going to be better. These things, they do take time, and there's subtle changes, and, you will, I'm sure, and maybe this is something you talk about. It's not that now you're at a position that every day you just have beautiful, positive thoughts, right? There are days where maybe you still have a weakness where that creeps back in, and you have to sort of fight to get back to where you want to be. Is that something that you experience, that it's, it's not a linear journey? It's two steps forwards, one back, is it?
Yeah. I mean, what are all the cliches? It's not a sprint, it's marathon. It's not a battle, it's a war, all that kind of stuff. But it's absolutely true. I do not want to come across as being like, yeah, I learned about this a few years ago and I am peachy keen. That's everything. Life is grand now, because it's not. It's absolutely not. It is a constant thing. Once I get to like maybe, for lack of a better way of describing it, maybe like a plateau of like, things are cool and I've got everything under control and things are going great, life inevitably throws me a curveball, and then I'm back into it again. So in this particular case of where I am currently in my current life journey, I have chosen to take a certain path. I've been planning for doing what I'm doing now for a while. So I'm totally cool, even though I know that I'm safe from a Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of perspective. I've got food and shelter and money and all that kind of stuff. It's all great. Inevitably, those automatic negative thoughts start coming up of like, this isn't going to work. And you're going to need to go find a job, and you're not going to be able to find a job because you're too old, or the industry's changed, or da. All the things that just kind of automatically just creep up, even though, as I said earlier, the empirical evidence will say, no, you're going to be fine. It's not like you're going to be living in a box on Main Street or anything like that. You're going to be able to find a job because you found plenty of jobs before. Statistically speaking, it's likely that you're going to be just fine. All that doesn't matter. I've chosen to take a curveball in my life, and that restarts the process of like automatic negative thoughts of different kinds start to crop up, but I have to use the same techniques to combat those. So for me anyway, it's pretty much going to be a lifelong kind of thing. All I know is that when I'm successful in battling things and getting new habits in place to combat these automatic negative thoughts, I'm happier, I'm less stressed. Life is just much more enjoyable. It's much more tractable. So that alone, I think, is worthy of the price of admission for the book. Just that kind of realization.
Yeah. And I wonder, if the last year, there's been a lot of different pressures coming onto people from all different angles. And, this type of foundation that you could potentially build to combat these types of negative thoughts, I think is a really good idea. And I'm going to look into this book because it sounds very similar to some other things which I'm investigating and I'm finding good results with. So I think I'll definitely look into that. But thank you very much for this, Dave. It's been an absolute pleasure sort of seeing under the hood of what goes on, because that is what the hidden layer is going to be all about. I'm asking people who they're on social media, and people see these shiny people who are obviously, really brilliant, or, that they're very successful, and you naturally don't think that these people have another layer underneath of struggles or insecurities. And that's just simply not true. I'm sure you could ask people, right at the very, very top of the deep learning field, people that you go, these people are mathematical geniuses. I guarantee they're facing the same imposter syndrome that everyone else is. It's relative to where they are, and they're comparing themselves to other people who are at that level. But I guarantee they're facing those same things. So I think a foundation like you've started to build is very good. So thank you for coming and sharing that with us. So I do want to mention, so each episode of The Hidden Layer, I'm going to be asking guests if they would like to make a small donation to a charity or an organization that sort of fits with their view of the world. Not only might it be a financial help to that organization, but it gives them great coverage. Maybe people who see this will realize that this organization exists, and they can reach out to them for help, or whatever that may be. Or potentially they see it and they want to also donate because they see that it resonates with them as well, and they want to support that cause. So you have generously donated to, and you have been donating for a while, to DonorsChooseorg, and I'll put the name up of that on screen. Can you tell us a little bit more about this organization and what they do, and why it fits with your view of the world and why you like it?
Yeah, so I don't know how familiar the audience is going to be with the United States. Americans tend to think that everybody's familiar with the United States because we're just wired that way. So I live in a state called Montana, which is, relatively speaking, it's towards the middle part of the United States, up north, and it's relatively rural and not necessarily super populated. And for most of my life, I lived on the west coast of the United States, in the Seattle area, in the northwest corner, up by Vancouver, BC, British Columbia, and Canada. And when I moved here to Montana about 2.5, almost 3 years ago now, I was struck by it's a very different type of place to live than where I was from. Not the least of which was in terms of public schools here in Montana. In the United States, we don't necessarily have the most sane way of funding public education. I'll just leave it at that. And in small rural types of school districts, public school districts here in the United States, they don't get a lot of tax revenue. They don't get a lot of resources. So what DonorsChoose.org does is allow you to find public school teachers that are trying to do projects, trying to increase the quality of education for the students in their classrooms, but they don't have sufficient funding from their school district. And obviously, public school teachers in the United States don't get paid very well, by the way, for folks who don't know that. So a lot of these teachers don't have their own resources to use. So what you can do is go find teachers, and they'll throw up a project on the website, and they'll say, hey, I want to buy laptops for my students because we don't have laptops. And it puts my students at an extreme disadvantage not to be technically savvy, have access to the internet, blah, 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 blah. And you can go and you can donate money to these teachers. You can see the projects, you can see the teachers, you can see their pitch, and then you can donate money. So I became aware of this when I moved to Montana, and I have been helping a friend of mine who teaches in a very small rural school district in Montana that doesn't have a lot of resources by donating to her various projects. So it's a cool thing because a lot of times the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, will also do dollar matches. So if you donate, they'll match it 1-for-1. So it's a really powerful way. And I don't know if they do it outside the US anyway, but in the United States, you can donate and help out public school teachers. So I think it's a worthy cause.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're saying about this one of the specific projects that, as an example of getting kids laptops that may not have laptops, or, even tablets, I think that's really important with the year that we've just had, when a lot of school children have had to work remotely. And if you don't have a laptop or a tablet because your parents can't afford one, then that gap between that wealth gap is only going to increase, right? Because the ones who have the laptops or the tablets are getting the opportunity to further their education, where the others don't have that opportunity. So I think that in itself is a really good thing to talk about, although it sounds like they're doing all sorts of different amazing things. So that sounds awesome. Again, I will link to DonorsChooseorg. But yeah, again, thank you, Dave, for coming on to the very first episode of The Hidden Layer. I know there's going to be a lot of people that feel empowered to talk about, or maybe accept, or even, I guess, recognize negative thoughts. And hopefully some of the advice you give, and maybe if they investigate the book or some of the other concepts that you've mentioned, will help them. And I'm sure there will be people, like you mentioned, that maybe don't understand the idea of negative thoughts. It's not something that they recognize in their own life, but that's okay too, because the idea of what I want to do with The Hidden Layer is talk to this broad array of people, and every one of those people is coming from a different place, and they're going to be talking about different things. So if somebody finds this episode, or they find this episode useful, but the other 50 episodes that we do completely irrelevant, then that's fine, because they've found something to resonate with them. And I think that's really powerful. So thank you again, Dave, and I will see everybody in the next episode.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Andrew.